Well, I met Fred Stokes about 14 years ago. Had a long conversation, and one of the things I learned about Fred was that if he calls you up and asks you, would you do something? And you say, well, no, I really can't do that. We just keep talking. And I know there's a lot of people in this room know that Fred knows, and you know now, that when he starts asking you to do something, you will eventually say yes. It's not a matter of how you're going to answer the question, it's only a matter of how long is it going to take you to answer that question. So I answered pretty fast this time. I knew I was in trouble. Fred, this is the last time. I'm retired now. I haven't done something like this for a long time. I'm glad you used the word visit. That's the key tonight. I'm glad you didn't build this up as some type of a big presentation. But anyway, I didn't quite know what to do with this looming corporate plantation. And so I decided, well, that calls for a little bit of history. And, you know, when you get to meet my age, you like to talk about history. You don't have much to talk about what you're doing now, so you like to go back and look over the history a little bit. And so I have done a little of that. In fact, I personalized it a little more tonight, sort of knowing this family here. But about 2 days ago, I read this over, and my gosh. You know, do I really want to replow all this ground again? There's some highlights I want to talk about, but do I really want to do this? And I thought about it a little bit, and so Barbara Ross is sitting here, and about 2 nights ago, I remembered one time she called me and asked if I would be on her Rural Life Day, and she gave me the topic to talk about the concentration and so forth. And I said, well, look, I did that just a couple of years ago. Yeah, she said, I know that, but I'd like to kind of have you do it again. So she kept after me until I finally agreed to that. Now, there were 2 other fellows she did exactly the same thing to. We got together afterwards and found out we got the same story. So after we said yes, she said, well, we're going to use the same title you used last time, except then we're going to put a colon. And where's the hope? Well, we all showed up. We'd agreed that we'd show up. So I'm going to tonight, I'm going to talk about a little bit of history and so forth along the line. But then I want to get over and talk a little bit about where's the hope and talk about possibility of a new vision. Times today we got down a little bit, and I think we need to realize that there really are some possibilities out there, and I want to talk about those a little bit. I mean, the other problem with getting somebody like me to talk too long. So let me get started. This is a little personal story, but I thought now that since you're friends, you might sort of enjoy this. When I was born, my dad worked at John Deere Tractor Division. Incidentally, I've got the first part of this written out. That's good, because otherwise I tell story after story. So, okay. So my dad worked at John Deere Tractor Division in Waterloo, Iowa, and in the late and early winter, he picked up a night job setting eggs in a hatchery. You know, they have to turn those eggs all night long type of thing. Here he learned that the scientists had developed medication to prevent many of the communicable diseases afflicting chickens confined in an enclosed building. When I was 3 years old, my parents moved to a small farm outside of town, built a little concrete building to house laying hens that were not going to be allowed to go outside. Well, that's hardly the beginning of industrialized chicken production. Or is it? Or is it? Suddenly, we had a technology. It could go lots of different ways, but it couldn't be done really before then. Now fast forward 19 years to 1961, in a much larger farm. I graduated from college, returned to the farm, and began to build what was then a large building in which we could raise 2,000 pigs per year. There were a couple other buildings built in the state about the same time, one of them at Iowa State. The production method was so new that there were no building plans available, so we used a turkey plan and modified it to fit a pork operation. Like the turkeys, the pigs were never let out of the buildings. About that time, I began reading articles in the farm press about vertical integration of the broiler sector in the South and using production contracts. Somewhere, in that 19-year period between when my parents started producing eggs and when they started producing hogs in confinement, the stage for the looming corporation plantation was being set. The contract was, of course, the key to that whole operation. Well, things didn't always go like you expect on something like this. One of the first things that happened was we got all set and all ready to go. Going to have this big farrowing and have all these little pigs and be off to a fast start. We got the pigs farrowed all right, but along with that we brought in TGE. If you know anything about TGE, sows they get a little sick, but no big problem. But every little pig you have will die in the first 3 days. Now there's an easy way we found out to deal with that, and that was if you take those little pigs that were died and put them in your mom's freezer and freeze them, and then sometime a month before you farrowed again, you take those out and kind of cut them up and so on and feed them to the sows. They would develop an immunity. You didn't have any problem with the little pigs. We did have a problem. Mom. But anyway, in time I decided that I could probably find something better to do with my life than to spend 16 hours a day, 7 days a week looking after pigs. You know, at that time my brother had just gotten his driver's license. There were 4 drivers, 1 car, and I had 2 other sisters, so the family always got the car. I got the old 2-ton farm truck that had those grain livestock sides on it, you know, and that was my courting car. You can imagine how much fun I had on that. Anyway, I decided there had to be a better life, and so I decided to go to college. I wanted to say I had to leave one thing though.
College, graduates.
Graduates go, okay, well, it's still college. I didn't leave my dear mom and dad hanging though. Just in case you want to know that I walk out on them. It wasn't long before things got to going pretty well, and in fact, by a decade or two, they really had a pretty nice car sitting out there in the garage. So things did get a little better. The key to that, folks, is they sold their pigs into a competitive market. And they would go as much as a 3-hour, haul them as much as 3 hours if they had to, but it was competitive. When Dad did that a few times, then the local packing plant would start buying his pigs again. They raised their price and everything, but happily, every now and then Dad had to show him that there was another market, and then he up along just fine. Well, I was fortunate enough, I got a research assistantship. I got to the University of Wisconsin. And up there, I was already, and of course, getting a little concerned about having been involved in this hog operation and reading about what's going on in the broiler industry. And that was really, you know, one of the things as a sociologist you get interested in is the whole matter of community. And that's when I learned about Walter Goldsmith. He was a young anthropologist. In 1941, he did a study out in California. 2 communities, one surrounded by large corporate farms and the other one surrounded by family farms. And then he looked at sort of the community life, and it wouldn't surprise you what he found was, which is what he predicted, is that those communities had far greater social life and a much more vibrant communities where you had surrounded by family farms. Goldsmith turned in his report to his division leader in USDA. The division leader immediately put that report out of sight. It took another 6 years before that ever got pried out, and Goldsmith got fired. He took off after that, he went to Africa where it was a little safer to be doing research of this type. So he learned a lesson about what happens when you start doing research in this area. Incidentally, he ended up being a professor at UCLA and president of the American Anthropological Society and so forth. As I finished my master's thesis, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I was given some encouragement to go on for a PhD, but I really didn't have a passion for it, except that just happened to coincide with when Brian Mayer's book, Individual Freedom and the Economic Organization of Agriculture, came out. And I read that book. And then I read it again, and I said, wow, this guy has really got this figured out. And so I decided right then, between the Goldsmith one and then Harold Breimeyer, I had the passion fuse lit, and I was off and on my way. And he basically, I won't go through Breimeyer's too much, other than to say that number one in that book, he really stressed the fact that and he was talking 61 things were already changing, but he was really talking about what had been, that we had one of the best, most productive food system in the country. It wasn't that we couldn't feed our people like later the Soviet Union couldn't do. Quite the contrary, if there was a problem in this country, it was overproduction. Remember that? And he pushed that hard. He pushed the fact, but it can be done. It works. We've shown it works. But you've got to have the regulation. You have to have the government looking over at what's going on, rather than buying out the government. Anyway, so he talked about the regulations, talked about the vertical integration and so forth. And so I was soon off to do my study. I got lucky and got to LSU, got some data gathered, and went on the study. Let me just comment. At that particular time, about the time that book came out, there were institutional economists asking questions: what policy is best for rural communities and the country? And that was really sort of in reaction to sort of the new breed of economists that were coming along. Basically, all the land-grant universities in at least in the Midwest, had a policy expert, and these were institutional economists. Now, there aren't many of those left anymore, but those of you who have been coming to these meetings regularly, you've met most of the ones that there are in existence today. And of course, Bob did a great job for us again today, and we always expect that. But I guess we've missed a few, haven't we, Bob? But you have to go quite a ways to find many. So there are still some around. There are kind of people. But the Freeman-type economists started moving in, and they really focused on efficiency, and a very narrow definition of efficiency at that. And they had no interest really in the social well-being. Political issues, social issues, natural resource issues were all pushed aside, and sometimes these issues that they weren't looking at were called externalities. Don't you like that word? To note that they were aware there was something else going out there, but they weren't interested in looking at that. And so it basically, the institutional economists really got moved out. But as they were leaving, kind of the last, and I think, Bob, you can check me on this, well, the last major thing that the group of those institutional economists who were policy workers did a series called Who Will Control Agriculture? And that was sort of their farewell. And it was a great set. It came out in pamphlets, and they had to talk about different parts of this and talking about different structural types. So that was sort of the farewell on that one. I did a study in Louisiana as I had planned. One of the interesting things, I went to the parish that had the largest number of broiler growers at the time I was doing the study. That was 1968, 69. And we interviewed all the broiler growers, we interviewed all the family farmers in that parish, and some of the corporate farms and so forth. But the one point I really want to leave with you is that when I went to Union Parish in 1969, I had very little agriculture. There was nothing going on. You had old cotton land that wouldn't produce, and the USDA had that listed as a persistent poverty county. But there were four integrating firms in there. Two of them were local people, and the other two were outside the area. One was Imperial Foods from England, and the other was ConAgra. And they were starting to set this up. But the growers at least thought, and they could, because some of them did, they could move from one of those growers, or one of those integrating firms to another. There was competition. And so they were really optimistic about the future. We went back in 82, about another 14 years later, to interview the growers and so on again. Some of them had new houses, brick houses even. It's pretty fancy. All you really didn't have to stop in to interview them. You just drive down the road, do what we call windshield reconnaissance, and you could see that the broiler growers were doing anybody else better than anyone else. And guess what? It was no longer listed as a persistent poverty county by USDA. And then we went back again in '93. But in the meantime, I forgot when we got there in the second study, the two local integrating firms had been put out of business. And the year after we left, ConAgra bought Imperial Foods. You want to predict with me what happened come the next study? Basically, it now had the highest farm sales receipt. Now, on a vertically integrated situation, I'm not quite sure how they calculated that, but anyway, so the state listed that as having the highest farm income, or sales basically, of any parish in Louisiana. And now it was not again a persistent poverty county. Does that show you what happens, the difference between competition and not? Well, the last thing I would mention, the last thing I would just call your attention is that at the end of Berglund's administration, or President Carter's administration with Secretary Berglund, he decided the last year he really wanted to take a look at the structure of agriculture. And I only bring this in just because it's so recent in terms of the repeat. And so he set out and had a big study, brought people in, had hearings all over the state, reminded me of what's just happened a couple, what, 2 years ago that as we all went through. He got this done, he's got a big forward in, was asking the right questions, taking a larger view of what was happening in rural America and farm families and so forth. This report, they sent off to the printer, it had trouble with the whole thing. It was delivered to the USDA building at noon. And that was the last day the Carter administration was in control. And up drive these trucks with boxes and boxes of this. And people didn't know what to do for a minute. And some of the people from the Reagan administration said, at midnight tonight, you have to be out of this building, and whatever's left, we're going to burn. And that's kind of the last we ever heard of that report, too. So, well, we just went through this.
Bill, the interesting thing about that report was the title, The Time to Choose. Now, a lot of people have seen that report, but it was followed up about, what's the year on that?
This is 81, January of 81.
So when about 90, in
about 10 years later.
About 07, they put out another report. It's called A Time to Act.
Yeah,
so
but
they said we had a
I'm not sure that was USDA,
Yeah.
was it? It was Center for Rural Affairs and others that were really pushing that one, I guess,
But
behind that.
USDA on the front.
Yeah, that's right. I can't find my copy of that. I went looking at it. Do you have a copy?
I do. I have a couple of them.
But it still didn't make it. It's still the same.
My point was, we went from them realizing we had a time to choose what direction are we going to go in
Yep.
agriculture, to them coming around saying, okay, the time to choose is gone, about 10 or 12 years later, and they say, now we have to act. So they knew all along. They knew what to do. They knew what they needed to do.
I think the other interesting part of the story you just reminded me of the other day was that Berglund's people put addresses on some of those boxes. And that's how Bill wound up with a couple of cases of those things.
Yeah, they went down and took the Rolodex, they said, and just wrote it on them and shipped as many out as they could. And, you know, I went to the mail one day, here was 3 big boxes. I couldn't figure out where they came from, where they were going, and then we found out the story. There's one other comment I just want to make on those studies. And lots of studies have been done since then. I mean, over and over again. And the results come out about the same. But there's one issue that kind of confuses it all. Economists, and for reasons, I'm not disagreeing. Economists consider size, farm size, as a structural variable. So when they talk about structure, they're talking about size of farm, and then what are some of the social variables and so on related to that. Sociologists, on the other hand, we don't consider size to be a structural variable. We talk about really the whole relationship between people and how it impacts. And so by and large, we always went back basically to looking at the 3 factors of production. You know, when the income, in the sense that that income gets distributed to the capital, management, and labor, the three factors of production. So the question is, how do they get distributed? And on a family farm, the traditional definition has always been that the family farm provides most of the labor, management, and capital. And then, of course, when you go to the broiler industry, you have the vertical integrated, and then you have the farm, or what they call the corporate farm hands. And so that was what we were using. And the reason that's important is most all of the studies that use the sociological definition, or anthropological for that matter, the anthropologists were using that, came out that there is a correlation, and the ones the economists did sort of were all over the place. It's not correlated, that's what it'll be. Okay on that, Bob?
You're okay.
Okay, all right. So you see, well, the economists and sociologists can't get along, especially if they're institutional economists. Now, some of my best friends, actually, honestly, one of my best friends was a dyed-in-the-wool neoliberal economist, but we had fun together anyway. Well, I want to shift gears now. So what I wrote here in my paper, where's the hope? And in little letters, with 3 question marks behind it, I put the fading of the corporate plantation. And I'm going to try and make a case for that. Yeah, can we find it fading a bit? Another piece I never say much about, but my business, my PhD minor was in business administration. Once I decided I was going to study these organizations, I had 2 years, I had to pick up a minor, and I looked around and said, what's kind of the most useful thing and what I want to do? And I decided business administration. In fact, I was within a class in accounting and one in finance of having an MBA. And I was always going to go back and get it, but never did. I never had that much money to have to worry about, I guess. But anyway, but I began teaching a course immediately on the sociology of organizations with a major emphasis on work organizations. The course soon became listed as a highly recommended class. I had so many MBA students in that class at one point that I was asked by the associate dean of the business school if I'd be interested in joining the business faculty. Not bad for an Aggie, huh? Well, I'd stay to be an Aggie, but anyway. I want to take just a moment. I don't want to get overly academic with you, but I want to give you just a little glimpse of kind of why I bring this up. This was my favorite book, my textbook. It's Work Organizations, Major Theoretical Perspectives, okay? So my information here, I just pull right out, I shorten and abbreviate a little bit, but right out of Kurtowski. Here's his comment. It's a sentence, 4 words long. Top management abhors unpredictability. Top management abhors unpredictability. Large firms try to control the environment within which they operate. Think of that. Think what that means. It's a little bit like the farmer who says, I don't want to buy all the farmland. I just want to buy all the farmland that adjoins mine. That's where they head to. That's what leads us into the vertical and horizontal integration. They want to control the environment that has an impact on them. They want to have control of the world. And that's what they were off to do. So I want you to just keep thinking of that. That is sort of a principle of kind of the organizations. And so that's what they're trying to do, is set up the stage so that their inputs move smoothly through the organization, get converted into the outputs and out the other end without any ripples. Now, if there's some cases they can't quite do that. If they can't do that, they at least want to be able to put a probability around those issues and potential that might potentially derail their operations. They have or can get whatever resources they need to move forward, but they must know what they need. And that means they need to have some idea what changes are coming. More than anything else, they want stability and predictability. Okay, folks, how can we destabilize this whole operation? Okay, what are the weaknesses? Have you ever seen as much rapid change in the food system as we've seen in the past decade. It just keeps coming, doesn't it? Now think about what might happen within the next 10 years. What's the food system going to look like? Is the farmer market business, and all this what we don't even have a good name for it anymore. We call it the alternative food system, just going to take over? Can you predict what it might look like? Do you want your life to depend on how close your predictions come? And that's what people in Smithfield and ConAgra and all these other places are starting to ask right now. Just for a moment, stop and think about the various commodities and think of the issues, commodity by commodity, that they're facing. The hog industry, the beef industry, the dairy industry. Do you know that the dairy industry, I don't know the exact number, but I know 6-8 years ago when I was looking at this, 80% of the dairy cows in this country are Holsteins, and all those Holsteins can be, 80% of them, not all, 80% of those can be traced back to 4 family names, and they've kept shutting that down. And they have such a narrow base right now, folks, that most anything could come along, the genetic base right now, and boy, the industry could be hung up. Well, at any rate, the point is, they've got their back against the wall. For decades, consumers would go to the store and pick up products without asking any questions. They knew very little about the food they bought, and they asked few questions. They trusted the food and assumed they would provide them with safe, whole food that was produced and handled in a way that were compatible with their values. Now, thank heaven, there are many activist groups, and we welcome them, and we welcome more, that are raising their questions about particular food products and so on. But it's not just the activists now. It's the doctors, it's the scientists, it's the authors, it's a host of others who are sharing information about the food system in one way or the other. You can't turn on TV set without hearing something about food. It may be how to prepare it, the safety, the information about how the food has been raised, and the list goes on and on. Newspaper articles about food are now a common feature. Consumers are probably more enlightened about food issues now than at any time since families produced most of their own food. 10 years ago, the USDA had basically written off small farms. They scoffed at them. Well, guess what? They are alive, and they're well, and they are growing, and so are their communities, and so is the sense of community pride. Did the retail stores 10 years ago think that there was going to be a big competitor out there for them? No, they missed that one. And they are scrambling like crazy to get caught up right now. And even Walmart hasn't overlooked this thing they let get away from them. Well, and competition hasn't been eliminated from the food sector either. It's thriving at the farmer markets. So one of the questions we have a little bit, though, is right now that I see that we got to deal with is what we call the farmers of the middle. That's kind of what they've come to be. That's where we're really having the pinch right now. So the big farmers, the big corporate farms, the small farms are doing fine. One of the questions, I think, the challenge we got is what have we learned from the small farmers that we can carry over to the farmers of the middle? That's still part of the question. Tonight at dinner, I'm glad I got to sit by Mike so I could talk with him a little bit about the mobile unit that he's gotten for slaughtering animals and so forth, and what those opportunities might be, and how we might begin to start moving those out to kind of complement the whole small farmers market type of thing to bring it into a little larger basis. So we need to look around at some of these kinds of things. Chris Peterson talked about his operation and really stressed the whole point on diversification and the way he handles his hogs and has a specialized market and so on. So we've got our work cut out. But the point is, we really need to kind of look back at kind of the history of that whole food system, especially for the local markets. One of the major reasons local food markets have burst onto the scene in the past decade is the opportunity for the farmer to develop a personal relationship with their consumers. They come to trust their farmers whom they know. They come to trust the farmers whom the corporate world is increasingly losing the consumer's trust. They can only get their message out through the mass advertising. The global food system has lost the trust of their consumers. And I would argue that's one of the biggest things that has turned around on this. Mary Hendrickson did her dissertation basically on this issue. She came over here to Kansas City back in 95, 96. We'd gotten called in by a group who wanted to put together kind of an alternative food system. They called it the Kansas City Food Circle. That's where we kind of got this got going. Finally got so interesting. They called us for help before long. Got so interesting, Mary decided that's what she wanted to do for the dissertation. Unfortunately, she got so busy, she never got around to getting that dissertation or parts of it published, but it's there. It's that personal contact that makes the difference. And these firms, the only way they can reach the consumer is to do more advertising. So now, with U.S. farmers and ranchers and so on, they're pouring millions of dollars into it. But the fact is, you don't reach people with just that type of a communication system. Okay. Well, there's some other things we could talk about, but I want to jump now to another topic. Jeremy Rifkin is an economist with the Wharton School Executive Education Program. Whatever all that means. The bottom line is, he's an economist, and he wrote a book, came out a year ago, called The Third Industrial Revolution. And what he says is that the first industrial revolution was when they hooked it up with electrical communication and converged with the oil-powered internal combustion engine. And I don't want to spend any time on that, but the second revolution, he argues, is the joining of, well, I got that wrong. The first one is steam power tied up with the printing press. The second one was the electrical and the oil combustion engine. But the third one, he argues, is the joining of internet communication technology and renewable energy. And he says that's going to give rise to the next generation. Now, he doesn't know anything about rural areas, but that's all right. But I want to just divert now a moment from the food system and show you a little bit in terms of the energy where he's going, and I think that might play back quite well with us on the food system. What he says is that the wind, solar, geothermal, and solid fuels is going to be a part of this. I use the term solid fuels because I want to back the ethanol issue out of this one for now. I don't want to open that can of worms tonight. I think right now one of the greatest opportunities for rural America is this whole clean energy business. What are they? Wind, solar, geothermal, solid fuels. Here I'm talking about corn stalks, that type of thing, okay? Why is it such a great opportunity? Well, let me go back about 3 or 4 years ago. Three of us got together, my neighbors, and we decided to, talk about, we had CRP land, and when we started, and we were wondering if we could produce solid biofuels for the Columbia Power and Light Company. And because Columbia has their own generator. And so we got to looking at that a little bit, found out that they were willing to try that a bit. We came off close to buying $1 million briquette machine, but we didn't quite get there. We did a little more financial analysis and quit. We found out that there would be enough material off of the CRP lands in Boone County and the surrounding counties that we could provide all the energy for Columbia. Now, that doesn't count the campus, okay? That doesn't count the campus. And then we started doing an economic analysis, and things went a little sour. But here's the interesting thing about all of these, but let me use biofuels as the issue on that. Hay and other kinds of material like that, cellulosic material, is so bulky that you can't get a big load on a semi. And if you can't put a big load on the semi, the transportation cost really goes up, right? That makes it ideal. Suddenly, all my life, when I've talked with the economists and talk about, smaller farmers being able to do this and such, they say, Bruce Bullock used to say to me, anything you can do on your farm, I can do cheaper on a big farm. And basically, while you try hard to come up with exceptions, by and large, there is such a thing as economy of size, right? But when you get into bulky material like that, they got transportation costs. And so in a sense, you sort of even the field. Now you get to go on from there. And so we'll be traveling in the contiguous counties, probably not more than about 50 miles. We can bring that stuff in and so on. Well, just to push this a little bit, the costs that we got at that point, and that was just as the 09, that was just as the phosphorus and potash were starting to head upward fast. The cost just made it not feasible at this particular time. The second problem would be if you're in a city like Columbia, they talk about sustainability. It's a college town, for crying out loud. But I agree with them, don't misunderstand me. The problem was putting all that fertilizer out there. You had to put almost as much fertilizer out there as you do for an acre of corn. Think what the cost was going to be. But think of the non-sustainability nature of it. But upon pushing that whole issue a little bit, we found out that if you don't put coal in it, if you do it just 100%, most of that ash is phosphorus and potash. All you got to do is figure out how to put it in a slurry or pellets or something, and you send it back out on the farmer's land. So now you've recycled. In fact, since the city would be picking up other refuge around and doing that, first thing you know, the city would have phosphorus and potash to sell. Now we need some nitrogen. And so I've been on some of my agronomy friends saying, can you find me a winter annual that comes on? I don't know, in our area we have wheat, henbit that comes in our wheat in the spring, starting about February. Can you get a plant, a legume that starts in February to grow, and by the time you harvest your wheat, the plant was dead, past its process, wouldn't come up till next winter again, okay? And so if we did that, and we were using warm season grass, because warm season grass doesn't come on until the end of May type of thing, why, we'd have that. Anyway, that's sort of where that goes. The point is, though, whatever we put together, and depending on where you are, whether you got solar, whether you got wind, use it, and the geothermal. But it all takes a lot of geographic space, right? And one of the things Rifkin says is, the days of the big factories is over. That because of the whole internet system, teaming this up with the internet system, we can move things, we can send things out like Mike does with his meat and so forth, and you already begin to start putting together some of those interpersonal communications. So there's some real opportunities, I think, knocking right now. And what the internet's going to be used, as Rifkin views it, as putting together a big national grid system and putting it together. One other thing the rural communities have is we have the infrastructure already in place in rural areas. All we need is an electrician who can switch a couple wires around. We can become a producer of electricity. We need to turn our co-ops around 180 degrees, and instead of buying electricity and sending it out to our rural area, we generate it out there, we run our farms, and we send it back into the transmission lines, and we get paid for it, just like whichever way it goes, plus or minus. So the whole infrastructure is laid out there, just waiting for the electrical co-ops to grab a hold of that. Well, so let me finish off here by simply saying, I'm really trying to cover a couple things. Number one, why the firms today, these firms, really have their back against the wall. They really do. Things are changing so fast, they don't know how to plan for it, they can't predict for it, they don't have any idea when Smithfield may come in and gobble somebody else up, or whether a Russian firm will come over and grab something. You know, they simply don't know. The other thing is that the technology is changing such that it really begins to make opportunities. Still, the bottom line in terms of food is, I still think, is that the whole issue of the contact you establish with the consumer. And until somehow these big companies figure out how to get the trust of those consumers, they're going to be in trouble. And when Mary and I first talked about that whole thing, we sat down after we've been doing these CR4 tables all the time, and that was one of our things as we got started working with the group in Kansas City, was to say, you know, what are the strengths of these large firms, and where are they weak? Let's not take them on where their strength is. And the weak, we said, was, you know, they couldn't develop that trust. What other weaknesses? I'm asking you, what other weaknesses can we come up with? Those are some of the things we need to do. My point, and I put it this, is to simply say, you know, I think we had a great meeting here. I'm not at all suggesting we let up on where we're heading. I am absolutely delighted that the litigation is going forward. We need to keep the pressure on those people. They got their back against the wall. This isn't a time to let up. What I'm really saying is, and it was part of Rifkin's goal also, is we need a new vision. We need to look out ahead, looking at the technology, looking what's possible. These old firms are still looking backward, trying to get back to the good old days. That's what's wrong with them. We got to go just the opposite and say, what are the changes out there? What are the possibilities? We got to think big, folks. Like I said, we're going to be the major generator for electricity in this country. We've got the land. We can put those solar systems up on our barns and our machine shed, or we can line them up. If we got a row of weeds, just go set your solar systems on that. You know, there's all kinds of things we can do. But we need to get kind of a new view. And I'm not the greatest fan of Jeremy Rifkin, but I do think, you know, I found his book really quite stimulating, partly because had been involved with the whole solid biofuels operation. So it's, you know, we've had a great meeting. I don't really plan on standing up here again, Fred, but all I want to leave to say is, look, folks, there's a new vision out there taking shape. The old saying, I've not yet begun to fight. And I think that's what we need to be heading for. I'm going to quit. Anybody want, it's a visit. I've talked too much. Anybody want to make comments?
Let me just say that OCM would have never happened had it not been for Bill Heffernan. Several years before, a couple of years before, we had the meeting in Jackson, in which I called him up, and he came down and spoke at the meeting before the formation of OCM. I read some articles about your concentration studies, and I targeted him as one of those guys that we needed to talk to folks and get them stirred up. So Bill Heffernan was to a large extent the inspiration for the idea of us coming.
I hope I've stirred your thinking a little bit anyway.
You certainly have.
Folks, there's new opportunities out there. This is a whole different ball game than it was 10 years ago. And all these other groups, David, your group, and all the rest of them coming in, the connection we're getting with the consumer. The consumer really can. What we're showing is the consumer really can back last. They vote with their feet and with their money. Other comments?